This week then, it's the turn of the albino. Misaligned in so many ways. A lot of people are scared of albinos because of the red eyes, and they think they're evil, and they think they're this, and they think they're that. And you know what? They're lovely. They're just the same as any other ferret. Binos, or albinos, Binos as we tend to call them, albinos, Binos, Beanies is beans, tend to be abbreviations for albinos, ferrets. And where with other species it can be a gene mutation that produces an albino, rarely, every now and then. With ferrets it's actually very dominant. In terms of genes, I'm not entirely sure if it is a dominant gene per se, but it's certainly more predominant in ferrets, and you get a lot of albinos. And I've had times literally where I've had one polecat, Polly, and 5 albino ferrets, simply because there were so many albinos in the rescue that needed homes because people just didn't like them. What makes it an albino is the same with any other animal. It's that the dye that colours our skin, our eyes, our hair, for humans, for every animal, melanin, that is actually not present in any albino, and that's what gives them that strangeness to our eyes, that there is no colouring at all. And albino humans, I think, tend to have a very blue eyes, I think, if I'm not mistaken, and that's because blue is where there's almost no pigment in the eye at all, where a dark brown colour is because there's a lot of pigment in the eye. Now for ferrets that translates, rather than a blue eye, as a red eye, because what you're doing is you're seeing right through to the back, to the retina, to some of the blood vessels, and that's what you're seeing in the red. It's not a sign of evil. It is literally just the back part of the ferret's eye that you're seeing. What makes it an albino is the red eye, in that you can get ferrets that are completely white, but they have a black eye, which means they haven't been punched. It means that they still have the ability to have melanin, in that their eyes are clearly dark, and so they have melanin in their eyes, and it's just that for whatever reasons their coat doesn't have any colouring in it. So this is definitely an albino. He's got the red, but there are albinos and there are albinos, and again, if you're new to ferrets or new to albinos, animals, they will all just look the same to you. But what I want to start looking at with the few that I'm going to bring today are the fact that you can still have differences in that. And my old boys, who are no longer with us sadly, Chili and Pepper, when I got them in the February of that particular year, 2016 I think it was, they both had this wonderful apricot colouring. So their fur, all yellow, was almost tinging on an orange, and it had this beautiful apricot to it, and they were stunning. Excuse me. Now Sid here is, hopefully you can see, quite white. His fur is actually pretty white. It's got that yellowness to it, but it's what I would maybe call a pale lemon. If you wanted to argue, or a cream colour. It is very light, and it's also super soft. Not that that has anything to do with his colouring, it's just that he is super soft, which is another way we tell him apart from the other boys. And again, he currently is very light, but when they molt he could come back in an apricot colour next year, so which is why we know from the fur, because the fur will always be soft, and that's one of the reasons we managed to tell him apart from his brother Snaffles, who I will bring up soon, but is currently covered in mud downstairs. So I'm hoping by the time I go back down he will no longer be covered in mud, and you will see that underneath all the mud there is an albino. So this is Sid. And the other thing to talk about as well is the eyes, as I've mentioned before, but from the point of view of the eyes can almost be, they can be almost like a ruby red, they can be a pink. So I'd say this one, little Siddle Squiddles, they're kind of like a quartzy pinky rose, in that they're not a deep red, they're not a deep ruby red, they're much more of this pink. They're not as dense, so they're kind of like lighter, like a quartz colour almost, aren't you, dude? So you had all of that. So hopefully you can see, and he's all over white. You can see though as well If you can see that there, he's starting to get a bit of colour. So this is that apricot-y sort of colour coming through here, if you can see in that darker bit. And that might take over the whole of his body, but for now you can see that this bit here, for instance, is quite light. So that's what we're looking at, and his head around there is quite light, and his ears, when I roll them back, you can see his head is quite light, and there's quite a lot of white around his face. So, Siddles, or Sid, if you're boring. Let's get another one for you. So this here is Snaffles. He's in the same group as Sid, so we call them brothers, but technically they're not brothers, to my knowledge. No, he isn't actually, because Snaffles is a lot younger. So hopefully you can start seeing now that Snaffs, again, has a slightly different shape to Sid. I don't know if you can see that, but he's actually slightly chunkier here. And he's actually on the back, he's a lot darker, so that he is still slightly muddy. He's wanting to be a polecat, I think. So he's got, all along here is darker. It's difficult to show in that he's slightly wet fur, but hopefully you can see there's a much darker line of yellow. But even then, his sides here, come on dude, on the side there is also slightly yellower. Hold on, I just need to bribe him. Notice the date of the feet, they should be white. And his nails need clipped, but he never stays still long enough. So hopefully you can see as well the side behind his ears, this neck part on either side. Can you see that that's slightly yellower, and the whole of him is generally a slightly yellower. And where if Sid was a pale lemon, what would I call this? This is more, there's more of an orange tint in it, so I wouldn't call it apricot, but it's more of a very light, super light sunflower, in that there's more of an orange to it, where I think of as a lemon as being more of a pure yellow, where I think of as a sunflower being more orangey in colour, it's got more red in it. And then I think of apricot obviously as a more of a yellowy orange. So, you know, it's super light. It's certainly not a sunflower colour, but it's that yellower, reddy yellow sides to him. What was going to show? His eyes are currently shut in delight. They are similar to Sid's. I would say they're slightly darker red, if you can see that. It's another way of telling them apart. They aren't as, the way the quartz thing isn't there, they feel more, they're denser in their colouring. Yes, dude, have a bit more oil. I'm not sure I'd go as far as ruby. I still don't think they've got that depth of colour for ruby, but they're certainly darker than Sid's. So for all this is also an albino and he has no colouring in him per se, he clearly does in terms of the yellows and the different colourings of the yellows. We've got two more for you. Pay attention so you can see the difference between these last two. So then, this here is Spooks. He was found in a graveyard in Walsingham. We got him as a kit, full of ticks, full of fleas. His ear was literally closed in from dried blood, from where the ticks had been in his ears and been on the outside of his ears, and literally the dried blood had closed his ear shut, and it took a week before I could slowly get that open because he was in so much pain and so scared still. And then we fed him chicken and he turned into this monster. He used to be teeny tiny, literally about this big, and then he turned into this monster boy, didn't you? So this is what happens when you feed them cooked chicken. So this is Spooks here, and again you can see he's a bit lighter. I would call him he's more of a white, again more of that pale lemon to white or light cream, so kind of like Sid, but I'd even say slightly lighter in that he doesn't have that darker yellow streak down there. If you look at him face on, you can see that he's got a very different face. His eyes protrude more, and I think that's the individual ferret rather than anything to do with colouring per se. And again, they protrude more, they're just bigger, and they're like big red currants. It's really well described. Neil there behind the camera gave me that one, which was brilliant. I was wondering how to describe them. And red currants is precisely what they're like. So it's a different colouring again. And if you notice as well, I don't know if you can see, but he's actually got a slightly longer muzzle than Sid and Snaps. They've both got slightly shorter muzzles. Again, that's more of an individual ferret rather than to do with albinos, but I just thought I'd point that out to try and show you the difference. That again, people are like, how do you tell the difference between an albino? What's one white ferret to another white ferret? And what I'm trying to show here that is that there's actually huge amounts of variation in their chonkiness, in the shape of their muzzle, sometimes the shape of their ears, you know, they've got big ears, how big their paws are, literally. And for us, it's about looking at the actual colouring within the colouring. So you can start seeing, hopefully now, that albinos still have variation to them. And again, you can see his tail has actually got a little bit more yellowness to it there. And if I show him that way, if you can see again, he's got a little yellow around his muzzle, and underneath there's a bit more. Hold on, let me try and do it this way. He's holding on to Mummy here. Can you see that there's a little bit more yellow under his bib? A little bit more. I mean, some of that's probably darkness to do with just the density of the fur, so, but there is a bit more yellow in there. Now this boy's a little boy, so if you can see, he's really hanging on to Mummy there. Can you see that he's hanging on to Mummy there? Because he's a little boy and he's still a little bit timid. He's pretty good, he's reasonably bomb-proof, but he still has his moments, and he can still be a bit clingy, can't you, dude? Even though you're also a bit bitey at times. Aren't you, dude? So this is the lovely, lovely Spooky Dukes. And we've got one more to show you this week. So don't go away. And so finally this week, this is the lovely, delightful Old Man Red. Old man as in he must be at least 7, possibly older still. And he's starting to look his age. Again, he's quite light, he's tiny, as I'm sure you can see, compared to even the earlier boys. I've kind of gone middle, Spooks being big and then Red being teeny tiny, but hopefully even from Sid and Snaff you can see how tiny this little man is. And he is a man. A lot of people think he's a Jill because he's so small, but no, he is a fully grown old man ferret. Now, again, he's lighter on the sides, a bit like Sid. He's got that line of darker fur there. Again, his paws are slightly darker, if you can see those. And he's got the darkness a little bit around his ears as well. What I want to show you is, it's not actually as noticeable today, but he's got a wonderful pink nose, but actually there's a little bit of brown on the very end of his nose. It's slightly different, it's orangey, it's more like a nicotine brown kind of staining. And that's actually, I think you can see him licking his nose quite a lot, and that's just because he's old, he's got things going on with him, and so he's licking, and the licking is actually staining a little bit on his nose. So if you start getting a little bit of that orange nicotine stain sort of thing on their nose, or just above the fur on their nose, have a watch of them, and if they're starting to lick their nose a lot, that's what it could be. And if you don't know the reason for that, then it's worth taking them to the vet just to get them checked out. The other thing you can probably notice with Red is that his eyes are quite cloudy. So that there is a cloudiness from a cataract in his eye, and the other eye is starting to get a little cloudy, but it's still slightly clear. And when he was younger, Red had proper, beautiful, ruby red eyes. And I think you can possibly see a little bit of that, but there is clouding now coming in because he is an old man. You can start seeing he's an old man. His fur's just staying a bit more ruffled. It's not going down as much, and he's actually lost a lot of muscle mass, but you know, he's fine. We took him to the vets recently just for a checkup along the lines of, he's old, is everything still okay? You know, I want to make sure that we are doing the best for this young man, old boy. And he's absolutely fine. He's got really bad breath. Don't tell anyone. But you know what? He's an old man. I'm not gonna bother about that right now. So the only other thing to note about Red, not to do anything with colouring, but just while I'm here, you'll notice that he's got a really small tail. This is not some sort of docking that you might do for dogs, which I believe is illegal now, unless for certain circumstances. It's not illegal, but I wouldn't do it particularly. This is been taken off because he had what we call a chordoma. So I think it's bone. That basically on the end of his tail he had a massive lump that I think is a bone growth. I'd have to check that, I can't remember now. But it's this growth on the end of the tail and it almost becomes like a little hammer on the end of his tail. And we left it until such time, because it didn't bother him, but then it got to the stage where it was so heavy on the tip of his tail that it was actually weighing his tail down. So then his tail was dragging, which meant that then that growth was getting sores from that, and at that point that's when it becomes an issue from the point of view of infection. So up until then it wasn't bothering him, it wasn't bothering us, so we just left it. But then it got big enough that we had to take him, and they recommended that we just get that little bit of the tail lopped off. Now it was further down the tail, but they had to take a little bit more of the tail off to be sure that it would actually, because if you notice, his actual tail ends there, the rest of it's fur, but they had to take that much off because it's such a thin part of the body that they had to make sure that there was enough blood vessels to make it heal. So they took it back further to be sure that the blood vessels would heal it. And as you can see, it's a dinky little tail now, and it's super cute when he walks. And his auntie Gillian knows this little boy as Radio Ham, I think because of the little antennae tail. So this is a very, very old man ferret, doing well, still with us, still feisty, and still obviously always an albino. And hopefully you can see a little bit now through the 4 different Binos that we have. We've got a few others, but these are the main ones I wanted to show you the differences with. And hopefully now after this video you will go away and think, okay, I can start seeing differences in albinos and starting to know what to look for: muzzle shapes, eye colouring, kind of how white they are on the sides to any different darker colouring along their tails. Sadly, I don't have any that are beautiful apricot colour at the minute, otherwise I would show you them. If I find any photos that I think will show that, I will pop them up and tag you guys, or pop them up on the web and maybe tag to this video. All right, take care. We'll see you next week when we're going to be talking about silvers and black-eyed whites.